FERPA. What is FERPA? FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act that gives parents and students 18 years of age control over their education records and the disclosure of their personally identifiable information. In short, information cannot be shared without permission from parents or an 18-year-old student. What types of records are protected? Records that are protected are records that are specific to the student and held by the school or a third-party vendor. These include things such as grade point average, health records, discipline records, attendance records, academic or physical testing results, and attendance records. Parents and students have certain rights under FERPA. The first is that parents ultimately have control over deciding to share personal identifiable information of their student with anybody outside of the school setting. Parents also can ask to see the records at any time and ask for any information to be changed or amended. It's important to note that parents can opt out of the sharing of their personal identifiable information under the guidelines of FERPA. And under FERPA, parents, if they feel that their privacy and confidentiality has been violated, can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education. There are some exceptions to FERPA. So, for example, anything that is not identifiable and considered public can be shared by the school. For example, this falls under what is usually known as directory information and includes things like their name, address, telephone number, a birth date, email address, their participation in school-sponsored activities and sports. Also, a misunderstood part of FERPA that is an important exception is that in the event of an emergency, the school can share personal information about the student. This is important because schools need to act in a moment's notice at a time of an emergency, and sharing that information sometimes is important for the safety of the school and for the students. FERPA and third-party vendors. A lot of schools work with third-party vendors that provide some sort of educational service. This could be anything from surveys and tests to computer programs or apps. When schools contract with a third-party vendor, the school basically acts on behalf of the parents and gives the okay to share information with the vendor as long as the service is going to be educational in purpose. However, a major concern is that some third-party vendors, while they accept FERPA responsibilities, don't always follow FERPA confidentiality. And so schools should be very careful about any technology that they use in their classrooms. They must set up some important screening type of things to make sure that third-party vendors are not abusing or not following FERPA. One key thing to remember is that oftentimes free vendors are not very good about protecting confidential information. A lot of times they are data mining, and so schools should be very careful about what vendors they contract with and use in their school settings. A couple of issues when it comes to FERPA. The first is immigration. It is federal law that all students who live within a school district boundary are to be educated in the school, regardless of their citizenship status. Under FERPA, even undocumented students are protected by the FERPA guidelines, and so their records are kept confidential. The Department of Homeland Security and ICE do not have special access to student records. And so if they were to come to a school and ask to see the records, the school can say and should say no. If the Department of Homeland Security and ICE shows up and they have a judicial order, such as a subpoena, the school district is advised to have their school district attorneys take a look at the order to make sure that it is in compliance with FERPA. The digital age has proposed some challenges to FERPA. It's important to note that that within FERPA, it really hasn't been updated for the digital age. And so there are some ways that some digital data can slip through the cracks under FERPA. There probably, a lot of people have said there probably needs to be an update to FERPA regulations. Some changes in federal law and in FERPA law have allowed companies such as Microsoft to collect and share data from students in school settings. Another major challenge with the digital age is ransomware and other cyber hacking activities. There are at least 100 data breaches every year for school districts, and that can be ransomware or hacking. And there is no guidelines under FERPA for what to do or how to handle that when that occurs. And so that's one way FERPA could be updated for the digital age. Surveillance cameras also pose a challenge to FERPA. Basically, for us, surveillance cameras have been shown not to be a violation of our Fourth Amendment protection of illegal searches. The one gray area would be like if a camera is used to zoom in on maybe information or something like that. Otherwise, surveillance cameras don't come under the regulations of FERPA until the video or images have been kept by the school and they are identifiable and associated with a student. And so if, for example, surveillance camera footage is used for discipline, even if it's as a student is the victim of something, it shows students breaking the law, a student is injured or attacked or has fallen ill or has a health emergency. In those cases, because the student is identifiable and this is associated with their student record, it then becomes part of their student record and is protected by FERPA. If the image is incidental, say for example, it's a video of a basketball game and they're in the stands, that's not a part of the student record and that is not protected by FERPA. Once that image is saved or the video is saved and associated with the student, then parents have access to those videos and images as well, and they can ask to see those at any point in time. Law enforcement cannot access surveillance camera footage unless they have a subpoena. And again, school district attorneys should examine any subpoena to make sure that it complies with FERPA regulations. Student resource officers are pretty commonplace in high schools and like in the one that I teach at. And so student resource officers and FERPA, there are some gray areas there on what can resource officers do. And so it's important to know that under FERPA, only school officials have access to student records. School officials are people that have an educational interest in the student population. If the school district hires law enforcement or SROs to maintain school safety, they're doing a function that would otherwise have been assigned to another staff member. And so they do have an educational interest in the school, and their interest and goal is to maintain safety. And so knowing that, then SROs and law enforcement officials do become school officials when they're used for that kind of services. Because they are school officials, they must follow the rules of FERPA, but they have access to the data and the student records that the school holds and maintains. It's also interesting to note that law enforcement records are not protected by FERPA. So if a student were to be arrested on school rec grounds, that arrest becomes part of law enforcement records and is not protected under the guidelines of FERPA. Some things that schools can do to ensure FERPA compliance. The first thing is to make sure that staff is very aware of FERPA. It's important to raise awareness to make sure staff understands FERPA. They know the rights, exceptions, and protections of FERPA for all students. Schools should very carefully screen third-party vendors in order to make sure that student data is protected. All school employees should be trained on how to handle school data, and schools should encrypt files and emails. Typical ways that FERPA is violated on accident is that schools sometimes forget to shred student records. They just throw them out into the dumpster, and that is a clear violation of FERPA. Also, if schools don't adequately screen third-party vendors and they share information with a third-party vendor who is data mining and selling that information, that is an inadvertent violation of FERPA. Sometimes schools don't know the rights for students and parents, so when a student turns 18, they have control of their student records. Sometimes schools don't understand that change in the control of student records. Parents maintain control if they still claim a student as a dependent, and so those things get a little bit tricky, and so schools need to make sure they understand that. Sharing too much information on social media Unfortunately, we have staff members who share sometimes too much on social media. And if they share something that basically can reveal the identity of a student, that can be a FERPA violation. And one that we are probably all afraid of is that when replying to an email and sharing confidential information, we accidentally hit reply all and share information with people who do not have an educational interest in that student or the school setting. Because schools protect student data, it's important for schools to educate parents. Schools should help parents know their rights when it comes to FERPA. Important tips for parents is that they should know they can opt out of anything that the school is sharing that can have any data about their kid. So this includes directories, surveys, third-party vendors, photos, videos, even military recruiting. It's also good for parents to know they can ask to see their student record at any point in time, and maybe more importantly, is who has access to those records. The third thing is that they should know that confidential information can be shared in case of an emergency, as we talked about before. And there's a lot of confusion on that, so it's important that parents understand. And the last would be that if a parent felt that FERPA had been violated, the process for bringing that to an administrator's attention, or even going higher and taking it to the Department of Education. Some tips for teachers when it comes to FERPA is that teachers should be very careful about sharing information with others. If there's any question at all that the data is or information is confidential, teachers should definitely not be sharing that with other people. In addition, it's very important that teachers keep student data in a secure place. And so, for example, things like IEPs or 504s should be locked into cabinets and only taken out when necessary. A common mistake is oftentimes people will walk away from their laptops and will not lock that laptop. And if that has, say, for example, grades open and a student were to access that it becomes a FERPA violation. And finally, teachers should not use websites or apps or things like that that collect personal information unless that website or app or other service has been approved by district administration. One important concept of FERPA that people overlook is that data should be destroyed when it is no longer used or no longer needed. There are no FERPA regulations on how long data should be kept. Other than that, once it is no longer needed, it should definitely be destroyed. There are several methods for destruction, and schools should choose the method that makes sure the data is destroyed and absolutely not retrievable. And so schools should work very closely with their IT department to make sure that data cannot be retrieved in any way whatsoever. Anything that can be pulverized, shred, or burned definitely should be. And districts should establish a formal process for data destruction, so it's very clear about what should be destroyed, when it should be destroyed, and to what level it should be destroyed. In my school district, our board policies reflect the language that we read about in this module. It covers FERPA and student privacy. It talks about third-party vendors and the process of doing that, the process for parents to opt out of sharing information, and it outlines the steps that the district takes for protecting student data. And so those things are almost verbatim coming right from the federal regulations and guidelines. Our board policies were updated in 2017, and so maybe in the last couple of years there may be a need to update as technology continues to evolve. We just went to one-to-one MacBooks and Canvas and things like that, and so it may be time for the district to update their district policies. But for the most part, everything is stated in accordance to state law, federal law, etc. So there's really kind of a big catch-all for all of that. Here are my references that I used from this module. Thank you.